When I took the road that night, the silence seemed to engulf everything around me. The car engine was the only sound I could hear as I drove along the deserted highway. The clock on the dashboard was approaching midnight, and the streetlights were sporadic, casting long, distorted shadows on the asphalt. In the distance, a few trees swayed in the wind, giving the road a sinister air. I was heading home after a long day at work, and the idea of driving along an isolated stretch had never bothered me before. But that night, something felt different. The air was heavy, as if something was about to happen. The dark, cloudy sky showed no stars, heightening my sense of being utterly alone. As I drove, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, as if a headlight was approaching. At first, I thought it was just another car, but the light seemed to waver, flickering in and out. Over the next few minutes, I realized that the headlight wasn't getting closer. It was following me at a constant distance. Unease began to grow, and I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror, trying to understand what that light was. When I decided to speed up, the light seemed to match my pace. A knot began to form in my throat, and the instinct to accelerate further took hold of me. The minutes dragged on as I tried to put distance between myself and the mysterious light. But no matter how fast I drove, it stayed behind me, always the same distance away. Finally, the light vanished, and I exhaled a sigh of relief. I looked ahead, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a bizarre coincidence. But deep down, something told me that night was far from peaceful. I kept going, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After a few minutes, I spotted an abandoned gas station by the side of the road. The structure was crumbling, and all the lights were off. Something drew me there, as if stopping was inevitable. I parked the car and got out, trying to understand why I had chosen that place for a break. As I walked around the station, a strange sense of nostalgia washed over me. It was as if I'd been there before, though I knew that was impossible. I was about to head back to the car when I heard a muffled sound coming from inside the building. It sounded like a moan, a low noise, but definitely human. The urge to see if someone needed help took over, and I entered the abandoned station. The darkness inside was thick, and the smell of mold was so strong it felt like it was filling my lungs. I walked slowly, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light, when I saw a silhouette in the corner. It was someone crouching, back turned to me, rocking back and forth. My mind spun, trying to process the unexpected sight. I tried calling out to the person, but there was no response, just an unsettling silence. I took a few more steps, my breathing quickening, until the figure stopped moving. A chill ran down my spine, and I began to back away slowly. However, before I could get out, the silhouette slowly stood up, and the person turned to face me, revealing a pale face and wide eyes that seemed to look through me. I froze for an instant, unable to move. Then, with a sudden survival impulse, I ran back to the car without looking back. Back in the car, my thoughts were scrambled, and my hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I sped down the road, trying to shake the disturbing image of that strange person at the gas station. The wind beat against the windows, as if urging me away from that place. I glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me again, but the road was empty. Still, the feeling that I wasn't alone clung to me like a shadow. A few kilometers ahead, I saw flashing lights at the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a truck with the emergency lights on. There was a figure next to it, waving at me. I slowed down and pulled over, feeling a mix of relief at seeing another person and concern about what might be happening. As I rolled down the window, a tense-looking man approached. He told me his truck had broken down and asked if I could give him a lift to the next town, as he needed a mechanic. I hesitated, recalling all the advice about not picking up strangers. However, the desperate look in his eyes and the weariness in his voice convinced me. I gestured for him to get in, and he thanked me several times as he settled into the passenger seat. The conversation was light at first. He told me about the cargo he was hauling and how unpredictable the road was at night. But as the conversation progressed, I noticed he kept glancing back, as if expecting to see something coming our way. His unease started to affect me, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that he knew something I didn't. When I asked him directly if he was expecting someone, he fell silent and looked away. After a long, tense pause, he finally confessed that he was running away. He avoided details but mentioned that he had witnessed something at the abandoned gas station. He said it wasn't safe to be on that road at night and that inexplicable things happened there. His words sent a chill down my spine. My mind went back to the sinister figure I had seen at the station. I asked him what he had witnessed, but he just shook his head, as if talking about it would bring whatever haunted him to life. Then, the silence was broken when a light suddenly appeared behind us, illuminating the inside of the car. The man looked back with evident panic and yelled at me to speed up. I pushed the pedal to the floor, while the light seemed to draw closer, almost blinding us. The man next to me was muttering something, maybe a prayer, and I felt the weight of the situation growing. I didn't know what was following us, but the sense of imminent danger was undeniable. Time seemed to stretch as I kept the car at full speed. The lights stayed close, and the sound of an engine echoed through the air, mixing with our own. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light disappeared without a trace. The man exhaled a sigh of relief, though he was still visibly shaken. I eased up on the gas, but I didn't stop. Something inside me said we shouldn't linger on that road. We continued down the road in absolute silence. The atmosphere in the car was heavy, and every mile felt like an eternity. The man beside me was pale, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. My own thoughts were chaotic. I tried to rationalize what had just happened, but there were no answers that made sense. Finally, we saw the faint lights of a small town in the distance, and the relief was almost palpable. When we reached the town, the man asked to be dropped off at the local gas station. As we parked, he turned to me, with a look that was both grateful and guilty. He said he needed to make an urgent phone call and preferred not to be seen by anyone else. Before getting out of the car, he handed me a crumpled business card, saying that if I wanted to understand what had happened that night, I should call the number. Without further explanation, he disappeared into the darkness. When I got home, I couldn't get that card out of my mind. Finally, I gave in to curiosity and called. A deep voice answered, and when I mentioned the man's name, there was a long, uncomfortable pause. The person on the other end told me to forget what happened and, in an urgent tone, implored me to avoid returning to that road. I hung up, and an uneasy feeling settled over me. That night had been more than a simple encounter with a stranger. I felt like I had touched a hidden reality, something I wasn't supposed to know. I reflected for hours, unable to rest. The road, the lights, the inexplicable fear that followed us. It all seemed like pieces of a puzzle I would never be able to put together. I decided to leave that experience behind, but a part of me still wonders what really happened that night and what it could have been. After all, some roads aren't just paths but portals to places where not everyone comes back the same. That's why I never traveled there again, though the memory still haunts me like a shadow that refuses to fade. I was heading home after a long day, the sky already dark and the road nearly deserted. I had been driving for hours, and the monotonous hum of the engine was almost an invitation to close my eyes. But the GPS, which I always kept in sight, made an unexpected sound, an alert to turn. Strangely, it was a route I had never seen before, but the road seemed to shorten the trip by almost half an hour, and that sounded like a good idea. I followed the instruction and took the secondary road, immediately noticing there were no signs. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by tall trees that nearly hid the sky. Soon, the GPS signal vanished and a thick fog began to form, further obscuring the path. The sense of isolation was growing, and something inside me suggested I should turn back. But instead, I continued, driven by an unusual curiosity. With each passing mile, the fog seemed denser, and I had to slow down almost to a crawl. Suddenly, I realized I could no longer see the road ahead or the trees on either side. It was as if the car was stranded in an empty space. I looked at the GPS, but the screen was completely blank, with no signal at all. My fingers began to tremble on the steering wheel as I tried to find some point of reference in the midst of that fog, but nothing appeared. It was as if I were driving on a road that led nowhere. After a few minutes of trying to move forward, I decided to stop the car. The silence around me was oppressive. I rolled down the window to see if I could hear anything beyond the hum of the engine, but I was only greeted by absolute quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I prepared to turn around and try to find my way back to the main road, but before I could put the car in motion, I heard a distant sound. It was as if something was moving in the fog, light footsteps, almost inaudible, but there. I stepped out of the car, thinking I might find someone nearby who could help me. I called out, "Is anyone there?" But my voice seemed to be absorbed by the fog. There was no answer, and the sound of footsteps ceased. Panic began to set in as I returned to the car and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. I tried several times, each attempt more desperate than the last. I was alone, without a signal, and with a car that no longer wanted to work. I felt trapped, as if the road were swallowing me, and a sense of claustrophobia took hold. I knew I wasn't alone, but the presence around me was invisible, silent, and threatening. After a few frustrating attempts, the engine finally roared to life. I felt an immediate wave of relief, but didn't hesitate to step on the gas to get off that road as quickly as possible. The fog remained thick, and visibility was nearly zero. Still, I pressed on, hoping the road would eventually lead back to the main highway. The silence was now accompanied by the relentless sound of tires on asphalt, as if something were chasing the car. I looked around, trying to see through the fog, but I could only make out distorted shadows and trees that seemed to get closer by the second. As I drove, the car began to tremble, and I felt a slight pull on the steering wheel. It was as if something was trying to steer the car off the road. The instinct to fight for control heightened, and I felt sweat trickle down my face. I tried to correct the direction, but the resistance intensified. That's when I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road, almost invisible through the fog. I slammed on the brakes, causing the car to skid to a complete stop. I stared ahead, but there was no one there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and wondered if it was a game or if there was really someone there. With no options, I kept driving, and fear now mingled with exhaustion. The road seemed endless, as if I were going in circles. With each turn, the scenery stayed the same. Tall trees, dense fog, and that terrifying silence. When I finally spotted a light in the distance, a wave of hope washed over me. I sped toward the light, hoping to find some kind of sign or building that could guide me. As I got closer, I realized the light came from a small gas station on the side of the road. It was an old place, with rusty signs and a single flickering light bulb. I pulled up next to the gas pump and got out, hoping to find someone who could help me. But the place was deserted, with an air of abandonment that made me even more uneasy. I took a few steps, and suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. When I turned around, the car was disappearing into the fog, as if being swallowed by a living shadow. I ran to it, but the mist enveloped it completely, leaving me there, alone, in front of a station that seemed as lost as I was. Desperate and with my heart racing, I looked around, searching for a way out. But the fog seemed to have thickened even more, blocking my view beyond a few meters. I decided to enter the gas station, hoping to find a phone or something that could help me. The interior was covered in dust and disarray, with empty shelves and an old counter. Nearby, I saw a payphone hanging on the wall. I rushed to it and picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. Trying to stay calm, I searched the surroundings for anything useful, but the place was completely desolate. Then I heard the sound of footsteps. They echoed on the concrete floor, growing louder and closer. My body froze. The instinct to run took over, but as I turned to the door, I saw the figure of a man standing in the entrance, shrouded in fog. His gaze was empty, and his face was covered in shadows. I felt my whole body tremble, and on impulse, I hid behind a shelf. I waited, holding my breath, as silence took over again. But now I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps approached and then disappeared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I rose and, with extreme caution, stepped outside. The station was now darker than ever. Without hesitation, I ran in the opposite direction of the man, trying to escape from that road that, somehow, seemed determined to keep me there. Seconds dragged on, and the chill down my spine only grew, but I didn't stop. In the distance, I finally saw a stretch of asphalt that seemed to extend beyond the fog. With my last bit of strength, I crossed over, running away from that endless road, with the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for another encounter. As we drove down the deserted road, the clock on the car's dashboard read nearly midnight. Our only companions were the steady hum of the engine and the faint glimmer of stars in the sky. We were on a long journey and decided to stop at a small roadside rest area. The place seemed completely empty, with only a few dim lights illuminating the parking spaces. I parked the car, and the darkness around us seemed to grow even heavier. Stepping out of the car, I felt the cold air wrap around my shoulders, as if the night had its own weight. My wife and I exchanged a quick look, and I saw the same hesitation in her eyes. We weren't fans of deserted stops, but exhaustion forced us to take a break. Taking a deep breath, we decided to walk a little to stretch our legs. As we walked, a growing unease took hold of me, as if something was out of place. I glanced around and noticed a few shadows in the distance, moving slowly. There was no sound, and the feeling that we were being watched began to intensify. We decided to head to the restroom at the stop, and as we approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man, with a vacant expression and slow steps, stopped nearby. He seemed alone, but upon closer inspection, I noticed other people scattered throughout the rest area. The man greeted us, but his tone was strange, almost forced. He began asking questions about our destination and where we were coming from, questions that felt more like probing than small talk. Tension filled the air, and my wife squeezed my arm, suggesting we head back to the car. As we moved away, I realized we weren't the only ones being watched. The other strangers were alert to our every movement, as if waiting for something. We quickly got into the car and locked the doors, breathing a momentary sigh of relief. However, looking into the rearview mirror, I saw that the strangers had gotten closer, forming a sort of circle around us. My heart raced, and I tried to start the car to get out of there, but to my dismay, the engine wouldn't respond. I looked at my wife, and in that silent moment, we both understood that we were trapped, not knowing exactly what these strangers intended. Adrenaline surged through us as we kept trying to start the car. The engine finally roared to life, but before I could shift gears, the strangers were already very close, blocking our way. I saw a woman with a disturbing smile on her face, and a man who seemed to be whispering something to the others. I felt the weight of their stares and realized they were intentionally surrounding us. There was no longer any doubt. Something was very wrong here. I thought about accelerating and trying to flee anyway, but one of the men approached the driver's side and punched the window, causing the glass to shake. My wife screamed, and I slammed on the accelerator, pushing forward to clear a path. The moment seemed to drag on, but we finally managed to break free and sped away, leaving the strangers behind. Yet, even with the car in motion, an overwhelming sense of impending danger lingered. Something told me we weren't safe yet. Driving at high speed, I began to see the lights of another car in the rearview mirror. I quickly realized it was one of the strangers following us. Panic returned with full force, and I pressed the accelerator even harder, trying to lose him. Each curve felt sharper, and the thick fog made it hard to see, but I knew we couldn't stop. I glanced at my wife, her face reflecting the same terror I felt. After several intense minutes of pursuit, I saw a fork in the road and made a sudden turn, veering off the main road. We drove down a narrow dirt path, hoping our pursuer would lose us. When we finally stopped, I realized we were surrounded by tall trees and absolute silence. We stepped out of the car, needing air and a plan. But then something caught our attention. A crumpled piece of paper hanging from a nearby branch with a threatening message. It seemed freshly placed, as if someone knew we'd be there. The sense that we weren't alone, that we were targets in a sadistic game, returned with even greater intensity. As we approached the crumpled paper, we could read the hastily scrawled message. "You won't get out of here so easily." Those words seemed to echo in the suffocating silence of the forest, and the realization that we were being watched made me shiver. I looked around, searching for any sign of who might have left it, but all I found was darkness and the dense trees surrounding us. My wife squeezed my hand, and I could feel the desperation in her grip. We rushed back to the car, trying to find some escape route. But as soon as we got in, the sound of footsteps quickly approaching alarmed us. One of the strangers emerged from the darkness and stood before our car, his eyes seemingly glowing in the dark. He pounded on the driver's door, and in a burst of instinct, I shifted into reverse and sped off, dodging him as much as I could. The path was uneven and filled with obstacles, but I kept driving, not looking back, focused only on getting out alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we spotted the lights of a small village in the distance. We made it to safety, and only then did we stop, panting and relieved. We hugged, still unable to believe what we had just experienced. That night at the rest stop, and the ensuing game of cat and mouse, would mark us forever. The memory of those strangers, the threatening messages, and the feeling of being hunted still lingers, but we survived to tell the tale. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed the stories, leave a comment. Your feedback is really important to us. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.